our wonderful technical person. He promised he would be right up there.
Can you turn the volume up a bit?
Can anyone see him? I can try shouting, but we all might get tired of that. Okay. Is that any better? Yeah. You can now hear. Okay. I'll stand on my tiptoes. I was thinking that I'm at a bit of a disadvantage addressing this subject, being short and female. So I'm going to ask you, please, to imagine that I'm 6'4" and male and wear a big hat. I have a friend named Jean Frances Oakes. I think some of you know her or heard her speak. She's a very respected elder who lives at Niganit First Nation just south of Maple Creek. And I'm showing you this picture, not because it has anything to do with our subject tonight, but because I know Jean would like it. She really likes horses, so she would be happy to see these two. Sometimes when we get talking, Jean tells me about things that she learned from her grandparents. Her good teachers, she calls them. Things she learned when she was a child. My kokum used to say, this is Jean speaking, my kokum used to say, to find out who people are, ask them, who is your grandma? Who is your grandma? That's how you find out who people are. So in keeping with this teaching, I would like to begin tonight by telling you a little bit about my maternal and paternal grandparents. These people are my father's family. They don't have anything to do with the subject tonight either, but I'm showing them to you because I've always thought they looked splendid standing there in the midst of all those gorgeous cabbages. My dad is one of the nice little kids there in the cool stripy ties. My grandparents and my great-grandparents are in this picture. These people homesteaded in the Peace River country, way up north, the last of the last best west. I think they were nuts. They had to travel from Edmonton all the way up to the Grand Prairie with oxen through days and days of muskeg. And then, when they got there, of course, it was all hard work. But their craziness paid off 10 or 20 years later, when the country to the south of them shriveled with drought. My mother's parents were not so lucky. Their throw of the dice landed them on a quarter section 5 miles straight east of the Hand Hills, near the village of Delia, Alberta. This is country that, if the Alberta government had been willing to go along with the community pastures scheme, would have been part of those pastures. Instead, it became part of the special areas, or very nearly in that, under that jurisdiction. And when drought struck there, it struck with ferocity. My mother came of age in the dirty 30s, and I grew up listening to her stories of suffocating dust storms, grasshopper plagues, the squish under your feet, gardens destroyed, washing devoured on the line, the fields blowing away. There were 10 kids in that family. These aren't they, this is my mom's class at school. And they bunked in an unheated lean-to, little more than a shed. There was seldom enough food or clothing. They got by on scraps of opportunity and hope. Our childhood never should have happened, one of my aunts told me. I'm a baby boomer, so I was born into rising prosperity after the Second World War. But listening to my mother's stories, watching her sit brooding over her third cup of coffee, shrouded in the smoke of her umpteenth cigarette, I knew that the Depression was not over. That dust had settled into her soul. Why am I telling you all this? Because when we talk about land in the prairie provinces, we are talking about people. There's a corollary to this statement, of course. When we talk about people on the prairies, we are talking about the land. That truth isn't as obvious to us now as it used to be, when everyone lived on the land and ate what the prairie provided, but it remains true nonetheless. Today, as always, the land feeds us. It supports plants that not only nourish our bodies, but also snatch carbon out of the atmosphere and produce oxygen for us to breathe. The land filters impurities out of water. Even today, we can't get by on iFood or iAir or iWater. It's just not the same. The prairie, land, and people are part of the same thing. And the land also nourishes us with its quiet, with its slowness, with its long timelines. It nourishes us with its beauty. A few days before my mother died, she was talking about her childhood, how hard everything had been. But the land itself, I asked her, the prairie, how did you feel about that? Oh, she said, I loved it. That gift of love for the prairie, of everything she gave me, that is what I am most grateful for. And I know that you have someone similar in your own lives, or you wouldn't be here in this room tonight. My mother and her family, along with tens of thousands of others, were the victims of a colossal failure of public policy. A policy that deployed men and women and children as pawns on a giant chessboard in which every square, every quarter section was given the same value as every other square. The agricultural settlement of the Canadian Plains was based on the bizarre and tragically flawed assumption that, as John McCowan memorably and influentially put it in the 1880s, there were no such thing as differences in fertility across the prairies. It is all equally good land. We all know how that chess game ended. It ended in checkmate. It ended in crisis. And you don't have to take my word for it. Here is University of Saskatchewan political economist Vernon Folk in 1957 writing about Canadian agricultural policy of previous decades. Available evidence, Folk wrote, establishes the existence of one major failure in the overall Dominion lands policy, the failure to base settlement of the prairie on anything in the way of land or climatic surveys, which would exclude from homestead entry those areas wholly unfitted to cultivation. Succeeding decades would be, in substantial part, devoted to correcting the mistakes of the homestead period. And that sorry state of affairs brings us, finally, to the heart of our subject tonight, the passage of the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Act and the creation of the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration, PFRA to its friends. In its first incarnation in 1935, the PFRA was given 5 years to address the soil and water conservation crisis on an emergency basis. Here's how George Spence, the first director of the PFRA, described that moment. When the PFRA started up, you see, nobody knew what to do. This was a general act, soil conservation, water conservation, and you had to find the methods of doing it. They didn't specify how to do it in the act. Nobody knew, and for that reason, everything that we did was an experiment. One of the first results of those experiments was the realization that 5 years would not be enough to remedy the effects of 50 years of bad public policy. In fact, it quickly became clear that in certain cases, the intervention would have to be ongoing. And so 2 years later, in 1937, the Act was amended to establish the Community Pasture Program with the goal of providing permanent management for the driest of dry lands. Permanent management. The idea was to combine conservation objectives with economic benefits for the regions that had been hardest hit, a goal that we would now describe as sustainable development. Here's George Spence again. Removing submarginal areas from grain production for use in the form of public ranches was seen to offer the twofold benefit of arresting soil drifting and stabilizing the economies of the dry areas. Now, as you can imagine, assembling the land was not easy, not with 3 levels of government involved, to say nothing of local school divisions and private landowners who, despite everything they were going through, were determined to hang on. You didn't think they were going to wither up and blow away like a bunch of old Russian thistles, did you? Nonetheless, land was assembled, much of it provincial crown land, and the rescued lands came under public management. In the end, there were and are 85 federal community pastures, totaling, why are we not making progress here? That's it, thank you. In the end, there were and are 85 federal community pastures, totaling 930,000 hectares, or 2.3 million acres. And here you can see them on this map. In every ecoregion, from the aspen parkland and moist mixed grasslands in the north of the prairie region to the drier, shorter mixed grasslands in the center and southern parts of our province. As you can see from this map, most of the acreage in the program is in Saskatchewan. 60 of the 85 pastures are ours, comprising 729,000 hectares, or 1.8 million acres. That's over 2,800 sections or square miles. 7,000 square kilometers. This still isn't helping us get a sense of what a big country this is we're talking about. Maybe it helps to say it's 3 times the size of the nation of Luxembourg. It's considerably larger than the province of Prince Edward Island. Of this total, a relatively small fraction, only about a sixth, are lands that had been plowed up unwisely and that have since been restored to grass. The vast majority of the land is the real thing. Realio, Trulio, never been plowed, natural grassland. Living, breathing, native prairie. This map shows the original area of grassland of the buffalo ecosystem in North America. And you can, easy to draw, hard to spell. You could draw in Saskatchewan up there in the middle of the green area at the top. This is what in our province we have left. The best estimates tell us that we have about just under 20% perhaps of the original acreage of grassland. And as you can see from this map, it's very, very fragmented. The PFRA, or as we are now supposed to call it, the AESB, I believe that's Agricultural Environmental Services Branch, community pastures constitute almost 1/6 of the natural grassland that remains in Saskatchewan as a whole. In some localities, however, the pastures are virtually it. They are 100% of the native prairie that is left in some parts of the province. This map shows the protected areas and conservation lands across the prairies. So you have a couple of national parks shown in red, you have some provincial parks shown in purple, you have some Saskatchewan community wildlife land shown in orange. The green on this map are mostly the community pastures. Think what this map is going to look like when Mr. Ritz is finished. You'll remember that the mandate of the Community Pastures program at its inception was twofold: to provide a measure of economic stability for small-scale cattle operations, and at the same time to provide conservation-minded management for certain sensitive prairie landscapes. Over the last 75 years, the Community Pasture program has been a proud success on both counts. On the economic side, the pastures are currently serving about 2,500 producers and are providing summer grazing for about 200,000 head of cattle. That's about 5% of all the beef cattle in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. What's more, the pasture program also owns about 3,000 purebred bulls, which provide a quality breeding service to pasture patrons. And all these services are provided on a fee-for-service, a cost recovery basis. The pasture program also employs about 120 permanent staff and 180 seasonal workers, many of whom are based either on the pastures or in rural communities. On the conservation side, the pasture program's achievement have, if anything, been even more significant. Over the years, the program's objectives have evolved and matured so that now the stated goal is to manage a productive, biodiverse rangeland and promote environmentally responsible land use practices. In other words, the federal community pastures are managed not only to produce beef, but also to produce Sprague's pipits and long-billed curlews and prairie sunflowers and swift foxes, all the special creatures that make a living prairie, that make the prairie ecosystem. Did you know that 31 endangered and threatened species are known to occur on the federal community pastures? And did you know that they receive the full benefit of Canada's Species at Risk Act, a protection that applies directly only to lands that are under federal jurisdiction and that will be lost when and if the pastures are transferred? Did you know that the management practices that have been and are still being developed on the community pastures represent the state of the art in grassland management and are being applied on other landscapes in Canada and elsewhere in the world? Did you know that the ecological services provided by the pastures, benefits like habitat protection, carbon sequestration, and water quality, have been estimated to have a cash value of $58.3 million a year. The annual cost to the taxpayers of Canada for these benefits is $8 million. I call that a darn good deal. Remember what George Spence said about the early days of the PFRA, how everything was experimental because nobody knew what to do? Well, the community pastures are continuing to serve as living laboratories where biologists and land managers work hand in hand to figure out the best ways to manage grazing to meet the diverse needs of the prairie's diversity of living things. And you'll notice I said to manage grazing, because these grasslands evolved to be grazed. It's what keeps them alive. So anyone who cares about these lands is going to want to see them used for grazing. We know that these objectives can be met. Tens of millions of American bison did it for millennia without giving it a thought. But it's a harder task for mere human beings to master. And the thing is, as soon as you get one thing figured out, some new challenge is sure to pop up. It might be oil and gas development, which we know is expanding in the grasslands, bringing with it service roads, fragmentation, invasive plants. They're the problems posed by a rapidly changing climate. And yet our Federal Minister of Agriculture, Mr. Jerry Ritz, in his wisdom, has decided that the job is done. According to his department's official website, the community pasture program is not needed anymore because it has achieved its original goal. And why these things aren't working just the way I want them to, I don't know. That's great. It's achieved its original goal. And so the whole program is to be dismantled over the next 6 years. Suddenly, it seems that every rural community in the far-flung corners of this province is flourishing and economically secure. Small-scale cattle producers must be raking in the dough. I bet they'll just all take us out for a drink once this meeting is over. And surely, the prairie ecosystem, what's left of it, must be in tip-top condition, with all its constituent species and processes enjoying vitality and abundance. Or perhaps not. The tragic fact is that despite everything the community pasture program has achieved, despite the best efforts of conservation-minded ranchers in managing public and private lands, despite the best intentions of conservation organizations, the prairie ecosystem is slowly dying all around us. Year after year after tragic year, we are losing the variety and abundance of plants, animals, and birds that are special to these northern grasslands. Have you seen this? The State of Canada's Birds, 2012, released at the end of June by the North American Bird Conservation Initiative with the involvement of Environment Canada, Bird Studies Canada, Ducks Unlimited Canada, Nature Canada, the Nature Conservancy of Canada, and Wildlife Habitat Canada. The report draws on 40 years of data to create what its authors call the first ever comprehensive picture of the current health of Canada's birds. Bird populations are indicators of the ecological integrity of the environment, the report reminds us. Healthy bird populations imply a healthy planet. And at first glance, the results may not seem too worrying. Just under half of Canada's bird species show declines, but a third of them are on the up and up, and the rest seem to be holding their own. And so on this graph, you can see a slightly declining line, the black line. You can see some kinds of birds that are increasing in numbers, but look at the lines towards the bottom of the graph. Look at the orange line. That shows the populations of shorebirds. Look at the purple line, that terrifying purple line. That shows the populations of aerial insectivores, birds like nighthawks and swallows. And the red line shows the population of grassland birds. In the case of aerial insectivores, nobody knows why the birds are suffering this calamity, though there is a possibility, which I find terrifying, that climate change is knocking them for a loop. As the State of Canada's Bird Report puts it, even a minor shift in the seasonal timing of insect emergence due to climate change could result in mismatched cycles of birds and their insect prey that could be disastrous for species with no alternative food source. Further research is urgently needed. In the case of grassland birds, by contrast, we know exactly what is driving the loss. Loss of native prairie and declining quality of the habitat that remains. Do these lines look familiar? Remind you of anything you saw just a minute ago? This graph charts the loss of grassland habitat plotted against total agricultural land since 1940. The blue line shows the change in the dry mixed prairie, the steeper red line in the fescue grasslands and aspen parklands. What would these lines look like if the analysis could be pushed back through the great plowdown of the early 20th century? And yet, our federal government can smugly tell us that the job is done and no further public investment is necessary. The provincial government, by contrast, has been trying to get things right. Under the leadership of Agriculture Minister Lyle Stewart, in consultation with our leading conservation organizations, the province has already agreed to maintain the pastures as cohesive units. It has promised to place conservation easements on the land when it is sold so that wetlands will not be drained and natural grassland will not be lost to the plow. It has offered the pastures to their current patrons for use as grazing land and has provided a little seed money to sweeten the deal. For all these decisions, we owe the provincial government a big vote of thanks. Yet, even with these policies in place, the transfer of the federal community pastures into private hands is bad and possibly even disastrous public policy. A program that has been trickling employment and services into rural communities will begin siphoning money out. The $8 million of taxpayers' money that has been invested in the program each year will no longer be flowing into rural communities. And how many millions upon millions of dollars will be drawn out of those same communities, those same economies, simply to transfer the land into private hands with no net benefit to cattle production. And once the land has been sold off once, who is to say when and to whom it may eventually be sold on? And the consequences for the prairie ecosystem, for the plants, for the mammals, for the insects, for the reptiles and the birds, for those other beings with whom we share this earth. For them, the consequences may be much worse. Without the kind of value-added management that we have been helping to support with this relatively small, actually very small, infusion of our tax dollars, without the systematic protection offered by the Species at Risk Act, our best hope for the survival and eventual recovery of prairie species will flicker and falter and possibly finally go out. A case in point. The other day, I got a call out of the blue from a woman named Val Finley, who lives in Grasslands, Saskatchewan. She had a story she wanted to tell me so that I could relay it to you. It seems that as recently as 1922, whooping cranes, one of the most magnificent and endangered birds in the world, this huge wonder, the subject of many decades of effort to bring them back from a population of 21 to several hundred, 437 was the last number I saw. These birds, until 1922, nested on a wetland called Shallow Lake in what is now the happily named Progress Community Pasture. Now, it's happened again. Did I hit the wrong button? Trevor to the rescue. Thank you. And so that little red star over there shows you where the Progress Community Pasture is. Unfortunately, the last of the breeding birds were shot that year, 1922, by some trigger-happy person. But now that community is on fire with the idea of bringing the cranes back, both for their own sake and as a bankable amenity for the community. And their project has been endorsed by George Archibald, the co-founder of the International Crane Foundation. A month ago, Mr. Archibald wrote to Minister Stewart under the header, "Re-whooping cranes and the importance of retaining the PFRA community pastures as Crown land." Meanwhile, the local sponsors of this project have gone on urgent alert. If the community pastures are sold, they warn, the whooping cranes will not be reintroduced. This is a single dramatic example of the kinds of possibilities that we are on the verge of losing. At a time when we desperately need a broader commitment to conservation on both public and private lands, we are on the brink of losing one of our most important and proudest assets. As I said earlier, the Federal Community Pasture Program has brought cattle producers and conservation biologists face to face to work with mutual respect and forbearance for the common good. Together, they have been setting the gold standard for grassland conservation. But the real work, the slow, patient work of species and ecosystem recovery has barely begun. Ultimately, I believe that we need a system that pays cattle producers for providing ecosystem services, including maintaining quality habitat for threatened and endangered species on both private and Crown land, wherever the opportunities for conservation are the greatest. I'm talking about an efficiently managed, targeted, results-based system. And I'm told that just such a scheme may soon be piloted in southwestern Saskatchewan by the Ranchers Stewardship Alliance. I can hardly wait to learn more about this initiative, and I wish the Alliance every possible success. I've just met the group's president, Oren Bayless, who's here tonight, and who I believe will be attending the workshop tomorrow, and I'm pretty sure he'd be very happy to fill us in on some of the details. If such a system were in place, the ongoing management of the PFRA community pastures might not matter so much. As things stand, however, we can't afford to give them up easily. I was immensely heartened to learn that SARM, the Saskatchewan Association of Rural Municipalities, has recently passed a resolution calling on the province to retain ownership of the federally transitioned pastures and to assist with the development of a pasture land management system structure. Of course, there's public management and there's public management, and what we really want is the superb kind that we have. I know that you will be, those of you who are able to attend tomorrow, will be hearing more about SARM's position and about other proposals that are being developed. I started this talk by telling you a little about my parents and my grandparents. I'm going to end by telling you about my granddaughter. Her name is Asha, and she is 17 months old. I knew you'd really like to see her picture. She puts me in mind of the people who will walk on this earth, who will walk on these grasslands after you and I are gone. When I look at her, I think of the long life stretching out before her. I think of her children and her children's children. I think of the children of all those other prairie inhabitants, the blackbirds and the harriers, the foxes and the burrowing owls. When I was a child, my kokums, my grandmothers, used to tell me, man, I think they meant men and women. Men and women do not live by bread alone. There is wonderful life all around us, and you and I, ladies and gentlemen, you and I are its last, best hope. Thank you.
presentation. It was wonderful. I knew Candace was going to be able to do that. And thank you very much. And you said all the right things that need to be said. Well, I'm sure some of you are feeling the same way as I am, but to take a breath for a moment, probably think of a question or a comment or something that comes to your own mind and heart that you'd like to mention. Just and a good friend Joanna is moving the microphone into place so that we can do that, because really what's needed here is what we've been short on over the months since this announcement came in March. I think it was March. We've been short on dialogue and talk about this. We haven't had enough people just with opportunities to say what they think, what they feel about these questions, what happens to this land that, as of today, is still in our public ownership. We all still have a share in this land and its destiny, and we have every right to speak to the question of how it will be treated from here on. So please come forward, and Candace will join me up here, and we'd love to hear your questions. Candace will respond to them. And then afterwards, we'll take a break and mingle outside there, and Candace can sign any books that you bought.
you very much. Is it on?
A little closer to
Okay. I'm just wondering, and other people will have much more cogent questions, I'm sure, about a lot of the topics you've talked about. I'm just wondering, though, I'm in the process of relocating to Valerie, which is right on the cusp of national grasslands. And I understand that the federal government is moving towards ramping up good tourism. Tourism isn't a bad thing, but it's a fragile ecosystem. And I'm wondering if you can comment on that development that's about to unfold. If you have anything to add.
I don't know anything about the specific proposals that you're talking about. In general, I think Grasslands National Park is an extremely good thing. It's actually the only publicly accessible grassland in the country. And one of the problems, I think, with these community pastures and with Crown land in general, in the prairies, is that we do not have, as citizens, any kind of relationship with that land. So grassland, the more people, I'm not sure that there have been enough people coming to Grasslands Park to cause it any harm so far.
They just lost the biologist.
Oh yeah, there's been staff cutbacks, and so that's another aspect of the behavior of our federal government that is causing problems for sure. But
I grew up beside Beaver Hills Community Pasture. Our farm was right alongside. It's not a grasslands community pasture, it's a forest. It was actually hard to believe, a forest in the middle of the parklands. But and I used to collect cattle in it for years, and it's just got emotional attachments. The pasture has been divided into two, and I think one of them is now called Bonnecourt. Ituna Bonnecourt, I can't remember what the other one is. And I saw that it was one of them that they want to sell. There's several questions about it. One is that a few years ago when the federal government was trying to do Indian land claim settlements, they were trying to give that pasture to Aboriginal people, and the public in the area made a big fuss about it. And I haven't heard anything whether they're doing that now, but I hope they will. Anyway, I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you, Candace. I think you did a tremendous job of summarizing the complexities around this whole development. And I think you have certainly implied this, but I wanted to emphasize my understanding of that really the self-funded part of the operations will continue in some form. What is being cut is the conservation portion. And while there are various proposals coming forward to try to keep these lands managed as pastures, there's just no way that provincial or local groups can come up with the kind of resources that have been put into these pastures over the 75 years to make them the best remaining grasslands. They are the evidence of the value of that management. And that's what's being cut. And I think by putting forward these proposals, are we not missing a step where we should all be in Ottawa demanding that these pastures not be divested?
I rather think that many of us felt that we would not be heard, but it's been working, so why are they being destroyed? Yeah.
I'd like to say something about that. I think you're very right there. We're kind of letting the federal government off the hook here. I wish I knew a way to not do that. I felt like there was a chance to get them to turn back. But Stephen Harper government has been all about scorched earth and just, they've made a point of never ever going back on any decision they make so that they won't get opposition like that. So now it's having the desired effect. Groups that oppose, would like to oppose some of the things they've done just don't even try. And we've sort of decided to do that in the conservation community because we're just cutting our losses and saying, well, we at least have a chance here in the province because this is where we live. This is where the people live who care about these things. Maybe we can do something here. And so, yeah, I think we have kind of given up on getting the federal government back to the table to do something here. But at the same time, I think that if we go forward as a community of interest that becomes powerful and strong enough that we're hearing, that the province is hearing from us, and we can work together and with the provincial government come up with a plan that goes forward, I think we'll have the moral high ground where we can then go to the federal government and say, okay, you want to offload these pastures and return them to Saskatchewan, but you're not going to get away with it without having to spend some money. We're going to ask them for some money. And I think we got to do that at the right time, and we got to have all of our ducks in a row and ask for the right amount of money. And they'll have to listen.
Candace and Trevor, two great prairie protectors and writers. We really thank you for your contributions. My name is Ruth Blaser. I'm also a companion of Native Prairie Grasses. Your talk, Candace, was so, as you always do, so thorough, so well researched. It's just such a great resource for making the case. And so my question is, will this be published, or how might this be available so we can lean into that information and be well informed? So that's my one question. Let me say,
Can I answer that
yes.
one? I have a friend who has a blog, so I'll give him the text.
I was wondering the same thing. And there's so many slides there. Oh, Butchie, that's I'd love to use some of those sometimes.
that is very generous.
What's your other question?
My second question is this, if you care to comment. My fear about this divesting of these beautiful, vast tracts of land is that the first step in resource extraction, getting at the resources, getting at what's there besides its own integrity and beauty, is to privatize it. So that's, I wonder if you care to comment on that. Is this a strategy that is simply putting the steps in place to get at the oil or the natural gas, or if you care to comment on that? Thank you.
There are better people, I'm sure there are people here who are better qualified to answer that question than I am, and I hope that some of them will speak. But as I understand it, there's nothing that protects prairie anywhere, really, from oil and gas development.
We should be moving in the opposite direction, putting more protection.
That applause is from people in our southeast who know exactly what's going on.
Yes,
Any
yes.
pasture down there. And another fellow who worked as the pasture manager at one of our southeastern pastures called Loman Number 1 has watched over the years his beloved prairie be decimated by the oil industry. But I spoke to him. He has quit now in disgust, and he's decided to do his own ranching. But I talked to him on the phone a couple of weeks ago, and he said, as bad as it was, he still knows that under the management of the PFRA system, they have some hope of improving and doing better. He said Loman was one of the first areas developed, and newer ones in Southwest sometimes are a little bit better. The damage isn't quite as bad, and they were working on it. The PFRA system was learning as they go, as Candace said. That's what they've been doing always, is making it up as they go along. And they're figuring out ways to create better setback distances and so on, and to improve on things. Because let's face it, we have to be honest, we're not going to be able to totally stop oil and gas development. What we have to do is mitigate and reduce the damage that they inflict on the land. I wish we could totally stop it, but we can't. So, you know, he said the PFRA system was getting somewhere, and it will be worse if that land becomes privatized. Then the little bit of protection it got under PFRA management will be gone, and the lands will be decimated, and there won't be any reclamation of any decent quality, and the setback distances won't be respected. There's nobody who will be mining the soil.
When I was starting to try to learn about this issue, I spoke to the endangered species specialist with the PFRA. I guess it's not what it's called anymore, but anyway, she's there. And she said that she'd been working really hard, or their whole teams had been working really hard in these pastures to try to figure out how to minimize the impacts of oil and gas activities, and that the people working for those companies were very cooperative and sympathetic and willing to do whatever they could. But unless there's somebody there trying to figure out what that something is, how can they do it? And so that research function has been a very, very important aspect, and is a very important aspect of the PFRA program.
Thanks, Candace, for your comments, very wonderful comments. I just wanted to share with everyone the protecttheprairie.ca campaign. I happen to be privy to the over 8,500 letters that have been written to Brad Wall in the last 6 weeks. And I would encourage everyone. These letters are from across Canada, and although there's a form letter that generally people just respond to through the webpage, several people have taken the time to write comments in that form letter about their connection to the prairie. And it doesn't matter if they're from Victoria or Ottawa, they all have some connection in their personal comments to the prairies here in Saskatchewan. And I think using social media like Facebook and Twitter and all those things, and keeping this going viral, those emails are being delivered to Brad Wall. And I think what I'm going to do as a project is extract some of those comments and perhaps share them with either you, Trevor, or Candace, and ensure that those comments, I don't know what Brad Wall's office is doing with them, he may have blocked them, I don't know. But there are over 8,500 already, and they keep coming in. So if everyone wanted to check that out in the lobby and make sure they go viral, that would be great.
Thanks, Kathy.
My, I guess, comment and question is about the conservation commitments that Canada has made internationally. You know, we've been talking about the conservation of the prairie. I think probably everybody in this room feels, you know, in their heart that they want to see the best thing done for the prairie. But the government of Canada, as many of you will know, has made commitments internationally to conserve a certain percentage of the land base of Canada. It came out of the Brundtland Report. People use the figure of 12%. Have you heard any discussion on this issue, either you or Trevor, about what the federal government is going to do to fill the breach if this land should get alienated, and if it went to, say, conservation easements? You know, there's categories internationally, and that would be kind of on the lower rung, and the pastures that are at a higher conservation level right now. And so we would be, I would think, maybe walking away from those commitments internationally. And it seems like the government made it, not the Liberal Party, the Conservative Party, but you know, the government of Canada made those. And what do you think of that, and what its role could be in this debate? And I've got one more question too after that.
Well, I don't know how the government is doing the arithmetic with the land, but absolutely they have used the federal community pastures as part of their commitment to biodiversity and even climate change, I think, agreements. So.
I think the lands were listed under Category 6 under the International Conservation Networks, and that, at the very least, is another piece of leverage that we have to use as public citizens to say, well, okay, well, what about this? We made a commitment to have this land under IUCN, and are we just going to blow it off if we get the Kyoto Agreement, or what are we going to do here? Yeah, I haven't really answered that question. I posed it a couple of times publicly, but I don't know how we get to people who have to answer that question. What's your second question, Rob?
I guess the second one is I'm curious about the level of I know that there's government's always trying to, you know, be prudent with our money, and that's laudatory. But you know, the federal government has put people and money into managing those pastures, and so what has been the commitment on the provincial side to come up with the positions and the management expertise to kind of fill that gap? Has there been any announcement in that regard? And because it's pretty hard to manage without people and money.
I think that's the point, exactly. That the pastures, there's a commitment to maintain the pastures and grazing. There's some evolving mechanism for monitoring conservation easements, but the staffing, the professional staffing, is just not going to be there anymore.
Do sell them when we have conservation easements. I don't really even have the minimal staff we take to monitor those conservation easements. And that would be absolutely minimal. It would be, what's that?
There's no one.
Yeah. We won't say how this guy knows this, but it's true. There ain't anybody in the province monitoring conservation easements that we've got, let alone a whole bunch of new ones. Bruce?
Candace, I wonder if, I have to confess, I was born in Prince Albert, and it took me a long time to see the prairie. We're not talking about Lake Louise. You know, we're not talking about the tundra, although it warms up there with money. But anyway, I have a feeling that if people, you have to kind of learn to see the prairie. It takes patience and time. And I feel like that's one of the things we're actually fighting against, is just the rest, you're sitting in Toronto or wherever, Vancouver, that people really don't value that land that we have here. And I think they're even in the farm community, I'm not sure about this, but I know that the way that farmers sometimes talk about land, that land is valuable, it's not valuable. I know there's a lot of farmers that support everything that's going on here, and like you said, SARM has been, made some important statements, but I wonder if you want to talk about that, because I have a feeling that it's, you know, somebody in Toronto or somewhere like that just won't get it.
I know, I've heard of this really good book about the prairies. It starts, there are people who think of the prairie as boring, and it is hard not to pity them. I don't suppose we can suddenly open people's eyes, but doesn't that mean that it's all the more important for those of us who do get it to do whatever we can?
I grew up in Toronto. And it took me a long time to get it. But once I got it, I just loved the prairie. I would not live anywhere else given any choice. What I don't get is that we can, I presume everybody here believes in it. Why do we have to say we can't stop the oil and gas? Why can't we? This is the Representative Areas Network, which is supposed to represent what we had. And talk to my daughter Laura over there. She's worked in Lomond, she's worked in Tecumseh, the pastures in the southeast. They are being destroyed by oil and gas, but they will be destroyed even more if we let them be privatized. What is wrong with us that we cannot say, this cannot happen? People people chain themselves, old women like me, chain themselves to big trees and said, you cannot cut this. They stood in front of the logging trucks and said, you cannot come here. I am willing to chain myself to a pump jack or to a cattle guard. Whatever it takes to say, this is wrong, do not do it.
Why can't we say enough is enough here?
Why are we still letting people plow ancient prairie? I don't get it either. All because it's private land, but you know, we can have public law that determines what people may do on private land.
Hi, thank you very much for your lecture. I just took a personal treat down to Grasslands Park for the first time, and it was just amazing to be able to walk out for days. I encourage everyone to do it while it's still there. Just a bit of a kind of an update / question. I've been to some government consultations in the past, and it seems like they're going to start in the southeast and actually strip mine across. Now, if you look at it, this is available online, and the Crown and Investment Corporation branch has kind of pre-approved this. And there's actually a company called New Coal that has over $2.5 million of acres of